We are live now, David. Welcome. This is my first Substack Live. It's very exciting. You're an old and dear friend, so I trusted that we could launch with you here today. Welcome and thanks for being here today,
It's
David.
great to be here. Glad to be the guinea pig. Hopefully it works out.
I know. Hopefully it works out. And for people who aren't watching live, this will be shared on Hopium tomorrow. And so, listen, welcome back. I mean, one of the things I want to do now in this new age of Trump is that I'm going to start developing in our community sort of trusted guides to get us through the challenges that we face. You came and spoke to us a few weeks ago. Hopefully, I can have you back, every few weeks, few months to give us an update on things. There's actually a lot to update on since we spoke last. About what Trump is doing on so many fronts related to immigration and the border, right? We have the legal challenges and his sort of attempt to abandon the Constitution, if you want to call it that, and to make things like due process sort of a bother as opposed to a necessity. We've had the revocation of TPS status for over 500,000 people just in the last few days. We've had the continued now, what's interesting is being part of a national community and tracking stuff that's happening all over the country. The number of stories that are appearing in local newspapers about long-standing citizen, not citizens, but long-standing legal migrants just disappearing and not returning to their house,
Right.
and being caught somewhere are increasing. I mean, you've been doing this. You are a leading immigration attorney and policymaker. We worked together extensively in the Obama era, collaborated a lot together on immigration policy. Tell us what you've seen over the last few weeks. What's the most important thing? Because one of the things that I keep reminding everybody is that this is not about deporting criminal aliens, right? We're way past that now. Talk a little bit about what you've seen and what you think is most important for us to understand.
Well, Simon, I like to call it the tip of the spear. I mean, immigration is the tip of the spear, and what's going on is you've got a pattern. While immigration is the focus, so to speak, you've got a pattern that goes after free speech. You've got a pattern that goes after, intimidating businesses and law firms and judges. So it is what we're seeing here is something which is the effect is to suppress to attack the rule of law, and the rule of law is what makes this country work. That may sound real technical, but what it means is, Simon, as you know, that we live by a set of organizational values. We have a government that is divided on purpose, separation of powers. That's how this country operates and is designed that way so that the executive, the president, or the Congress, or even the judges don't accumulate too much power. We have the executive, that's Donald Trump and his administration, and then we also have Congress. Congress has been compliant. The Republican Congress has been absolutely compliant, and they've abdicated their responsibility, their constitutional responsibility. So far, we're seeing the courts step up. Hopefully, this continues. And I've got to applaud judges like Judge Boasberg in Washington, D.C. in the Alien Enemies case, who is under tremendous pressure from the administration, public reprimands, and all kinds of name calling and impeachment threats and that sort of thing. And he is applying the rule of law to the case. So that's hopeful. But we have seen all kinds of attacks on immigration. But what's important for people to remember is that while it looks like it's immigration, it impacts all of us, right? Out of the box, we had an attack on birthright citizenship. That was the first thing that came down almost the second day of the administration. And that is if you get rid of birthright citizenship out of the 14th Amendment, you cheapen citizenship and you expose Americans to second class existence in this country. We all know why birthright citizenship was in the Constitution in the first place. It had nothing to do with non-citizens. It was about protecting Black Americans at the time, former slaves, who were by the infamous decision in Dred Scott considered chattel. And the 14th Amendment was put into the Constitution to make it absolutely clear that everybody born in this country is a citizen of this country with some exceptions, meaning diplomats, those sort of thing.
David, can you talk about the difference between just getting into some basic vocabulary for folks about citizenship, legal permanent residence or green card, TPS, right?
Mhm.
Because what's happening now is that we're moving way beyond undocumented immigrants or criminal migrants
Mhm.
into an attack on a whole set of a whole class of people that goes way beyond, I think, what Trump said he was going to do during the
Right.
campaign, because they knew it would be unpopular, by the way. So they lied about what they were, going to do. And one of the things that I researched today, for example, is there are 13 million green card holders in the United States. And so can you just do a baseline course on how you become an immigrant to America and what the process is for how you get all the
Sure.
way up to citizenship? I think that would be helpful to
For
folks because I don't
folks.
know that people really know what a legal permanent residence
Right.
is or a green card. So let's just do some baseline
Yeah.
vocabulary setting. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be very basic because it can get complicated. But the bottom line is there's two ways to immigrate to the United States. You can do it based on a family tie. So that would be married to a US citizen or have a parent who's a US citizen, or a spouse. Or you can do it on the employment side. Company technical Usually it's a company that sponsors the immigrant in a job for which there's been a shortage, and the companies, by the way, have to prove that there's a shortage by advertising and recruiting for a US worker. There's some exceptions to that. People who are of extraordinary ability can self-petition. So if you've got a Nobel Prize or you're on your way, you may have a shot at self-immigration. But those are the two basic ways. We have also investors that are under the employment side. So it's a family tie or an employment tie. And then, of course, certain people can come here as refugees, and that's by quota. That's a very low quota. And that is set by the president. By the way, this president Trump has sought to obliterate the refugee program. And other folks who come here to the United States can apply for asylum, regardless of how they get here. And that's not me interpreting, that's the law directly. It says, regardless of how you get here, you have the right to apply for asylum if you are in fear of persecution or have been persecuted. So those are the various ways, and there isn't that much more. People tend to think, Simon, that if you're married to a U.S. citizen, then you're a non-citizen. A foreign national is married to a U.S. citizen. That, in and of itself, makes them into a green card holder. Let me explain what a green card. But that's not true, and I'll explain why. But a green card holder is, well, let me back up. So most people that come to the United States every year, there's millions and millions of people that come here every year, and as visitors, as workers, actors, all kinds of people. They come and they go through our ports of entry. And by the way, that generates a tremendous amount of income for us, in terms of tax dollars, in terms of spending, sales tax spending, all that kind of stuff. Businesses, we thrive off of visitors and tourists that come to the United States. This is an attractive place to visit. We've got all kinds of beautiful sites and places to go. We've got businesses. So there's millions of people that come here. Those are temporary visitors. Then there's the next step up. Like I said, based on an employment tie or based on a family tie, somebody can become what's called a lawful permanent resident. That we generically call that a green card holder. And what that means is that individual, once they achieve that status, they can live and they can work in the United States permanently unless that status is taken away. So, what most people have learned, Simon, in the last few weeks, watching TV and listening to the news, is that a permanent resident can lose their status pretty quickly. And that's not new. It's just that in most cases, until this presidency, permanent residents would lose their status, A, if they committed a crime, a bad crime, or B, if they left the country and gave up their home, they would abandon their status. And there's other ways, smuggling, criminal activity, drug activity, that sort of thing. But it can be revoked, as we can see, by operation of the Secretary of State. That was a provision that hadn't been used since the early 90s, early 90s. So I guess the lesson here is that everybody in this country who is not a citizen is vulnerable to being removed. I remember when I used to teach at the law school, and the bottom line is the Supreme Court of the United States, in a variety of Cold War decisions, made it really clear that a permanent resident, a green card holder, is a visitor to the United States, is a guest in the United States at the end of the day. And we all know that we can ask a guest to go home at the end of the evening. So it's the same principle. And I think what's going on, I don't think, what I see going on now is that we are realizing that the power of the executive, Donald Trump, to cheapen the permanent residency, the green cards of people is enormous. And that's what's happening. And the next step from there is citizenship. We saw the first attack on citizenship with birthright. We will see in the coming months an effort at what we call denaturalization, that's taking away citizenship from people who are foreign nationals and then applied for citizenship. You have to be a green card holder for 5 years, 3 years if you're married and living with a US citizen, and then you can apply for citizenship. But that can be taken away in a number of circumstances. If you lied on your application, even a small lie, forgot to put down a misdemeanor, forgot to put down, something that you may have done that you were embarrassed about that may have affected your citizenship application, it can be taken away. If you join an organization that was considered subversive, within 5 years of becoming a citizen, it can be taken away. So there's various ways. I mean, when we talk about losing citizenship, most of us think of Nazi war criminals because that's usually where that statute has been used over the last 40 years, when they removed people who were Nazis who came to the United States and didn't tell us that they were Nazis because they never would have gotten in, and they took their citizenship away. But what we will see, I believe, I'm sorry to say, is an attack on citizenship through the denaturalization statutes. And that, I think, is coming. That's something that Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff in the White House, has been talking about for many years.
So let's drill down on a couple parts of what you just went through. And before we do that, actually, let me raise, there's one other thing that's been in the news recently is TPS holders.
Yeah,
And can you talk a little bit about
yeah.
TPS and just how many there are? Because what you've laid out is that there's sort of new vulnerability in green card holders through the exploitation, and we'll get into a little bit more detail about that in a minute. That's 13 million people. Then there are people that could have their citizenship challenged because of, as you went through this. Then there's also TPS holders, who are people who came here legally,
Hmm.
were granted, temporary protected status is the term. Can
Hmm.
you talk a little bit about what's happening with that category
Yes.
of immigrant?
Good point. TPS, or like you said, temporary protected status. Let's be really clear. This is something Congress put into law. This is not an executive order. This is not something that some president said, okay, we're going to have TP. This is Congress. This is the law of the United States, which provides that if a country is in an upheaval, whether it's a major earthquake that shatters the country, whether it's a war, example, Lebanon right now, or Ukraine, whether it's some other horrific thing that happens to the country and prevents its functioning, the president has the authority under the law or through the Department of Homeland Security to declare, to award TPS. And typically the way it's done is temporary protected status is provided to the citizens of the country who've been in the United States from the day that that TPS was issued forward. In other words, they don't want to backward. I'm sorry, backward. So let's say TPS is issued today for name the country. Anybody who was here today would get the TPS. People coming in tomorrow would not. And that's the reason is you don't want to, policy-wise, you don't want to have TPS so that people then start coming in. So it doesn't attract people to come to the country. What it does is it gives them a temporary legal status. They are lawfully in the United States, regardless of what Mr. Vice President J.D. Vance says, when he attacked the people in Ohio for eating cats and dogs. Those folks were here illegally, are here illegally. Many of them on TPS, many of them asylum applicants, lawfully in the United States. So we have people from various countries who are here on TPS: Cuba, Ukraine, Lebanon, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and others. There are other countries as well. And what the president did last week was he suddenly issued an order, a regulation, a notice in the Federal Register withdrawing the TPS from these folks. And like you pointed out, now these people, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of folks who are in the United States temporarily, but have families here, have jobs here, have livelihoods here, have added to their, importantly, added to their community, added to the fabric, the cultural
And
fabric of
have,
their
and
community.
by the way, have kids in school, by the way.
Yeah, and kids who
Kids
are
in school.
US citizens too,
Right.
right?
In
Because
school. Right.
yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Kids in school. Some of them are employers. Some of them do very well. And most immigrants who come to the United States do very well economically because they're driven. They create jobs for US workers and so on. So now they're uprooted. Now they have to make a decision within a month as to what to do. Most of the TPSs, people with TPS, those will end on a rolling basis throughout the year, but it gives them no security. And can you imagine if you've been here for years because your country's in upheaval, and now you have to go back and the country has not settled yet? So it puts people in a horrific position. But importantly, what it does, and this is why it's so, Simon, if I may say so, and I know I may say so here, is it's insidious because it takes people who are lawfully here, who are quote unquote playing by the rules, which is what the opponents of immigration always point to, and makes them undocumented. It's just cruel. It's just cruel.
Well, and the thing that blew my mind about this, and we now, I mean, I haven't gone through and done the math. The new announcement was 530,000 people losing their TPS status, their temporary protected status,
Yeah.
in a month, right? Meaning that you have a job, you have your kids are in school, you have family here, you have potentially a rental contract, or you own a home, right? And you have to, in theory, now leave the country in a month, not in 6 months, not in a year, where there'd be sort of a transition out, right? And so this is being done cruelly, in order to put maximum pain on immigrants for Trump's performative need to crush people's lives and to use the power that he has in a sort of dictatorial and whimsical fashion. But we're now talking also about, I mean, I want to just sort of do all the numbers here, right? There are somewhere between 11, 12, 13, 14 million undocumented immigrants. Very few of them are criminals. We know that. And because we have data on this. I mean, the rate of crime being committed by immigrants and undocumented immigrants is much lower than native-born Americans, right? So
Mhm.
as a piece of the population, of that 11, 12, 13, 14 million of undocumented, they have no social safety net. They have the highest worker participation rate of any demographic group in America, because if they don't work, they don't eat, because there is no social programs backing them up. And many of them are now long settled, been here for more than 20 years, and are established in their work and their families, and their kids are in school. They have citizen US children, right? So there's that pool. Then there's 13 million green card holders. There's probably, David, I'm just estimating based on what I've been reading the last few days, a couple million TPS holders, right? And what's happening is that they're systematically going after each of these pools now. And you've also raised the issue of recently naturalized, or the denaturalization process. But we're talking about the total number of immigrants we're talking about here now is approaching 30 million people, right? And at minimum, if you do the undocumented immigrants and the green card holders and the TPS holders, that are all now being told to leave the country, and that they are not welcome here. This is an enormous, this is, slightly less than 10% of the population of the United States, right? We're now talking about, who are under some kind of um, attenuated status in a place of greater danger. And if you could next, just in the evolution of your course today that you're teaching us, David, is talk about what how the ICE operates differently than American law enforcement. And in terms of the necessity of a warrant or so on, like, why are people just disappearing and not being given their day in court? And with what's happening, I wrote about a case today at Hopium where a woman who'd been here in the United States for 50 years, had a green card holder, Filipina immigrant, came here as a child, was coming back from the Philippines into the US and has been detained for a month and is not, and they don't have any explanation for what's happened. She just didn't go back to work. She didn't go back to her house. She ended up in immigration, being detained by ICE up in Seattle. And she's now somebody who's been living here. You would not know she wasn't a citizen, right? She's somebody you work with every day, or in the community. And now all of a sudden she's in, and she hasn't been able, the family hasn't been able to see her yet. So talk a little bit about how does ICE operate in regard to these various communities, given this very broad mandate they have now?
Well, first of all, ICE is under the same constitution as the rest of law enforcement agencies throughout the country. It's an administrative law enforcement agency that works for the Department of Homeland Security. But look, here's the thing. ICE is subject to the Constitution. So if ICE comes to somebody's house, um, that person, if they don't consent to letting ICE in the door, ICE can only come in if they have what's called a judicial warrant, right? And that is a warrant that is signed by a federal judge. They have to go to the federal judge, show probable cause, get that judicial warrant like any other law enforcement agency. But what typically happens is they will use what's called administrative warrants. It says warrant on the top, and then it's signed by an ICE official. Looks very good, but it's not the same as a judicial warrant. So folks not allowed, should ask for to see a judicial warrant. ICE is bound by that. That's very important. And most people don't know that. And even businesses, I've been doing this a while, and this is the first time ever that I've had numerous businesses contact me about how do they protect their employees, hospitals, how do we protect our patient areas, our service? What happens if ICE comes onto premises? Where can they go? And these are this is not limited now to immigrants. All right, so people do have to realize that the Constitution does apply. When somebody is arrested by ICE, they do have the right in most cases to a bond. Now, there are some people who are not bondable. We'll talk about that another time, serious criminals, but most people do have the right to ask for a bond, to go to an immigration judge. Now, because the courts are so backed up, Simon, it can take a month, 2 months just to get a bond hearing. So meanwhile, they're sitting in ICE detention, and ICE can transfer people anywhere they want in the United States. Because it's federal. So we saw that with that case in New York where they arrested the Columbia student graduate and sent him to Louisiana, even though the case was in New York. They do that. That is fairly routine procedure. They'll transfer people far away. But they do ultimately, people have the right to go before an immigration judge and have their cases heard. So while ICE is there to enforce internally, they are not above the Constitution. And a lot of folks, because they're immigrants or because they may not have citizenship, feel that they may not be protected by the Constitution. And I would encourage people who have those questions. There's great information on this. The ACLU has a great website and their immigrants' rights page. The National Immigration Law Center as well. I would encourage folks. That's aclu.org or nilc.org. Great know your rights information, downloadable in 16 languages. So people should look and see what their rights are.
Talk a little bit about El Salvador and what we know about what's happened with, as it's been called, the rendition of, in many cases, legal residents of the United States who now have found themselves in a prison in El Salvador. Just reflect upon that, David, if you could.
Well, back up. I mean, what happened here was the president invoked the Alien Enemies Act last weekend. It seems like months ago now, but it was last weekend. And under the Alien Enemies Act, it's very interesting. This is an act that hasn't been used since World War II. And it was also an act that unfortunately led to the detainment of American citizens of Japanese ancestry during World War II, an infamous moment in American history that we all are ashamed of. Anyway, this was invoked, and to invoke it, the law itself says, Simon, there has to be an invasion. There has to be invasion or declaration of war, irregular warfare in the United States. And so what this claims, the declaration that the president signed claims that there is an invasion, and that invasion is through Trinidad de Agua, which is TDA, that's the vicious Venezuelan gang, and that's being directed by President Maduro. This is what it says okay. So even assuming we accept those facts as true, which show me the evidence. The folks who are considered part of this horrific gang, and look, none of us want horrific gang members here, and none of us want terrorists, Hamas supporters here. I mean, that's a given. What we're talking about is how do you discern who is who? And in fact, what they did was they had apparently they had these planes ready to go on Saturday last week. And once the declaration became public, they began to whisk these planes out of the United States in the hopes that they could do it before a federal judge issued an injunction, which they knew was probably going to come. And that is what happened. And the dispute that's going on now in Washington, D.C., before Judge Brosberg is who knew what when. In other words, when did these planes carrying the Venezuelans leave the United States? Did they, that's going to be sorted out by the judge. The motivation for using the Alien Enemies Act in the current situation is something I think the Trump administration is going to have to explain in court and justify in court. It's a little bit different to go into court and justify something than it is on Fox television. So it'll be interesting to see when they get to the merits what they say. Long story short, Simon, as you know, these planes went to El Salvador loaded with people who they claim are Venezuelans who are members of TDA. And we saw these horrific videos. It was almost like a real reality TV when these people got there, and they were hunched over in chains, and then their heads were shaved and so forth, and they were thrown into this infamous terrorist prison in El Salvador, which is notorious for torture and degradation and humiliation, all kinds of things. And one guy apparently, turns out, was not a gang member, probably more than one, I don't know, but this poor guy was a barber, and it turns out that he was caught up in all of this. So it looks like there was not a lot of vetting that was done to see who was on the plane, and I think that's the issue. That's the issue before the judge as to who actually was removed under the Alien Enemies Act, and he issued an order today, actually, which is 37 pages on this, keeping his injunction in place for now, meaning keeping his block to the Alien Enemies Act in place now. And this is going to be litigated. And I think that the question that this judge is going to want to know is what was going on here. How does the government justify invoking the Alien Enemies Act under the current set of circumstances, under what happened here? And I guess we'll see what happens in court, but it's pretty stunning. And you think about what people voted for, right? Last fall when they voted for Donald Trump. I mean, I don't think it's pretty clear people voted based on the polls. They were voting for a secure border. They were voting because they thought the price of milk was too high and the price of eggs were too high. And my question when I see all of this stuff, whether it's birthright citizenship, whether it's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, whether it's using a very vague foreign policy provision to deport the student at Columbia, um, you know, how does this lower the price of eggs? And you talked very articulately about the people who are being could be subject to being rounded up with TPS. There's another word for the folks who are undocumented. And Trump used it himself during the pandemic, and that's called essential workers. These are essential workers. These are the people who put food on our table, along with American citizens. But these are the people who work in vital industries in our economy. And what is going to happen if they're gone? What is going to happen if they're chilled and they go underground and can't work? Price of eggs, I think, is not going to go down. Price of milk, the price of food, and other areas, construction, infrastructure building, roads, on and on. What is the economic impact of what's happening? We're not going to feel it today, probably. We're not going to feel it tomorrow. But is that what people? I think a lot of people who are Trump, supported the president, are going to be very surprised at what they voted for when their neighbor disappears, when their doctor disappears, when the person who's taking care of their father or their mother or their grandparent in assisted living disappears. And this is not just we're seeing this happen. So that's going to be the stunning surprise to, I think, a lot of people who voted, for something else.
Well, and we last time you were here, David, we spent a long time talking about the economic impact of all this. And, there's no part of America that's going to be more devastated by this than rural America, where there's already worker shortages and any kind of agricultural economy, the long-term care facilities, healthcare, where there's already incredible shortages in many rural communities. This is all going to get far, far worse. And so what's incredible is that the part of the country that's probably going to receive the greatest immediate hit in terms of the workforce reduction, because we're talking about potentially millions of workers being removed from the United States, in the next 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, depending on how far they go, right, and how aggressive this all is. But certainly, if you just talk about the TPS holders that have already had their TPS revoked, we're getting close to 1 million people so far. And so, yes, what that does is that it makes it harder for all the parts of the economy that are heavily immigrant dependent to function.
Yeah.
And so, and that means that healthcare costs are going to go up and food costs are going to go up and hotels and restaurants are going to go up or be harder to run. And we're going to see also, because of this aggressive behavior, we saw the other day, David, it's been reported, and the government is disputing this, that a scientist coming into the United States from France for a
Yeah.
conference was refused entry. In part, he claimed, because of things that he had written that were anti-Trump, that they had from the seized computer and social media. We now have some of our closest allies in the world have issued travel advisories to the United States to their own citizens, letting them know that they can't guarantee that if they come here, even with all of their papers and everything else being legal, they can't guarantee that they don't end up in a difficult place or detention. The story of this Canadian actress, has been all over the media, a woman who has been acting coming in and out of the United States for decades, a well-known actress, was detained for 12 days, coming back, I think returning back to the United States, right? She was trying to come into the
Yeah,
US,
that's right.
for work, right? I mean, for work, and she was detained. And so, we have a situation where tourism is going to be heavily affected, where conferences in the United States, people are going to be unwilling to come for meetings here in the United States. We're also going to have, David, something that's not getting a lot of discussion that we should talk about next time, which is it also means that not only are we losing people now, but immigrants are not going to try to come here, and there will be a restriction. In theory, they're going to, I'm sure, make it very difficult for green card holders to become citizens, but also for people, the future immigrants will also be heavily restricted, which will also have disproportionate impact again on these same industries that are already getting affected. And so the dislocation, forgetting about the human rights issues and just sort of the treatment of human beings and the way that they're being treated, sent to foreign prisons, given a month to leave the country, right? All these things that are going on, sort of the fear that, I mean, I have friends who are U.S. citizens, who are immigrants, who are literally, or who are getting concerned about being denaturalized, right? And so,
Yes.
this is like becoming. I've had this expressed to me by friends of mine who you would see them on television and not even know they were immigrants to the United States, right? People that we all know, and so who feel this fear. So not only do you have this fear that's being put into the population, which is part of their strategy for self-deportation, right? Where they want to put so much fear and worry. They want these stories to be widely broadcast so people self-deport to save them the money and the resources required to remove the 11 to 15 million undocumented immigrants, to try to get as many green card holders as possible. But we're talking about a potential enormous change in our population in a very short period of time that will not only be immoral and wrong on so many levels, but it's going to be devastating for our economy. And so the sort of fanaticism behind this, the kind of racial animus that's driving this, is so wild and whimsical and manic and careless in the way that they're also attacking the government of the United States, right? What happened with these people, sending these people to El Salvador, there's been another stories. The New York Times had a story about four of the Venezuelans that were sent to El Salvador. One of them was a professional soccer player,
Mhm.
and and a legal resident of the United States who had never committed any crimes. The young guy in New York, we know that they're now backpedaling a little bit on the legality of what's happening to the New York student, because they're now claiming that in his process of applying for a green card that he did it improperly, right? So they're trying to make this whole idea that if you have any mistake in your history of application through the immigration process, that you're now vulnerable to being removed from the country, which is another kind of tactic to force people out of the US, right? We're seeing a really big thing happen. And the fact this was advertised as prioritizing the removal of undocumented criminals, when in fact it was a much larger assault on both the existing immigrant population in the United States and future migrants coming into the US, that's going to have enormous impacts on tourism. I shudder to think about what's going to happen with the World Cup next year, where we're supposed to have millions and millions of people from all over the world coming in to fill these stadiums. I don't know if people are going to come. I don't know if there are going to be players that are going to not want to come to the United States, because of the fear of them being detained, right, while they're here, because they can't possibly provide any kind of guarantees that people who are coming in as part of this process are somehow exempted from the dragnet that's been put into place. I mean, the significance of this is unreal for a country that was founded in part based on the notion of people coming here from all over the world, right? Of all places. And so it is really a stunning set of events. And I do think you're right that the courts have been holding so far. But let's just close with this, David, if you wouldn't mind, is that any other observations you have for anybody that we didn't cover today? Optimism, fear, worry. Help us, close it out here for us by reflecting on all this and how far we've come in such a short period of time.
Well, I think the sense of optimism comes from the fact that, look, at bottom, the American people are good people. They really are. I think most Americans are going to be extremely shocked and surprised at the effects here, what's going on. And so I think that's where I start. I do believe in our country. I do believe in our people. There's a lot of good people out there, and that includes people who voted for whomever. Uh, and so that's where I start. I also think that there is, I do believe very strongly in the courts. I'm concerned. I'm less concerned about the courts than about their decisions being given respect and followed. That will come later, I suppose, when the Supreme Court weighs in on some of this. I think if there's any bright line, if there's any optimism there, it's that at the end of the day, they do seem to, the Trump administration, at least at the moment, is following the orders. They may be screaming and yelling about them, but right, for example, there's been no more deportations under the Alien Enemies Act since the injunction went in place. So there is that. That's a very small thing. but it's a sense of maybe these courts will hold, maybe this will go forward. I also have a lot of hope that people will continue to talk about this, will continue to be out there. You know, the service that you're doing, for example, and educating the public, making sure people understand exactly what's going on and the policy reasons behind it, the dangers. I mean, most people don't. It's very hard to make that connection between a mass deportation, between borders that are now unfriendly. It's one thing to have secure borders. We all want that. It's another thing when somebody arrives in New York with the intent to continue their scientific research or to go to a conference and present and contribute and gets turned around because one of their WhatsApp messages was critical of the administration. And that's not, so, you know, that is something that I think people don't understand unless it's really sort of broadcast out there. So I think we all need to continue to speak up. People need to speak truth to power here. Speak, hold our moral, the morality. We have the moral high ground here, and it's that the whole biblical injunction or the phrase, if I don't stand for myself, who will be for me? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So this is the moment in American history. This is a moment in American history that we will all look back on 20, 30 years from now and ask ourselves, what did I do? And even if it's comforting, your neighbor who's upset about something, even if it's something as simple as that, every one of us has a role, whether it's speaking out, whether it's running, speaking out on a Substack podcast like this, and serving the public that way, whether it's going into a courtroom, whether it's writing, or whether it's, like I said, comforting your neighbor, whether it's calling somebody up and asking how they are, whether it's, of course, voting is critical, but we all need to play our part and do what we can to protect our country. Because at the end of the day, Simon, it's going to be up to us. It's going to be up to us.
Well, and let me, David, close with two final observations. And one of them was something I alluded to in the Hopium post this morning, is that one is that I think the sort of multi-pronged attack on our scientific uh, and technical and medical leadership in the world is not been adequately sort of expressed in the national media. That a central reason that America is the strongest economy in the world, that we lead, our companies lead the world in virtually every field, is because of the federal research monies that are enormous and aggressive and ambitious and been wildly successful. I mean, Mark Cuban just posted that he went and looked at from 2010 to 2016 every single major new therapeutic drug that was legal, made legal by the FDA, that was approved by the FDA, had NIH funding behind it at some point, right? And
Mhm.
so the other piece, though, of that scientific and technical and medical leadership is that we have pulled the smartest people in the world from all over the world to come feed into that system to give us this technological edge over China, and in particularly China, right, who we're now in this brutal economic competition with in the world. And that entire ecosystem, which has been a central driver of our prosperity, is being dismantled strategically on purpose, right, by the attack on the research institutions, higher education, and also now future migrants. Because who in the world, if you could choose to go to Canada or the UK or Germany, would you come here? Right now, given everything that's happened, that you could end up in detention and your kids could be, your citizen kids could be left homeless, right, by an out of control immigration system. But the second observation I have from just today, and I mentioned this is something we're going to be talking more about at Hopium, is how central the exploitation of racial fear has been to the Republican project since the 1960s. And that, I look back at our history and how we got here. And one of the most consequential decisions in all of American history was after the civil rights era in 1964 and 1965, when the great landmark civil rights legislation passed after John F. Kennedy's assassination by Lyndon Johnson and by the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, had a choice, right? Would they join the Democrats in advancing civil rights and civil liberties in America, or would they fight it? And in what will be known, I think, as one of the most important decisions in American history, they chose to fight.
Okay.
And they developed something called the Southern Strategy. And the Southern
Mhm.
Strategy was developed in the mid 1960s by Republican political operatives and strategists and funders, the community that we all know all too well today, all these years later, who created a strategy to go to the other side of where the Republican Party had been on race and to exploit the racial fear of Americans. Now that Democrats have been the party of racial reconciliation after our own sordid history on that, going back all the way to the founding of the Republic. And and that they, through the Southern strategy, they were going to appeal to racial grievance, to flip the South, which had been where the base of the Democratic Party had been going all the way back to the founding of the Republic, and that by flipping the South, they would build a new majority, and that would remove this long period of Democratic dominance that started with FDR in the 1930s. And so the Southern strategy was the central strategy of domestic offering of the Republican Party. It's what drove tax and spend, right? Tax and spend, which was that old phrase that we all knew from politics decades ago, was you're taking money from deserving people and giving it to undeserving people, or the Willie Horton ads in the 1988 election, or
Mhm.
find your version of it, right? But what is incredible to me about what I watch now in the dismantling of the US government, the sort of manic desire to rip things apart, injure people, to cut USAID and allow millions of people to die around the world, to end all the HIV programs, is that there's a sort of an almost sort of genocidal racial rage that is playing out in America right now that is believable in its ferocity, its intensity, its inhumanity. And the thing is, I have talked a lot about, David, and I'll end with this, about USAID and how significant it was that that was the first big thing that Elon targeted and sort of vaporized, right, in a week. It went from being a fully functioning global agency to being gone, right, in 7 days. Is that once you are comfortable allowing millions of people to die on purpose, which is what the vaporization of USAID is, there's no other line to cross, right? That line that Trump and Musk
Mhm.
crossed through the vaporization of AID became the signal to us about their relationship to human life and to the ability for people to live, right? And it put them in a place, it put the country in a place of unbelievable darkness that we're now seeing manifest in a related way through all the things that we've been talking about today. Is this kind of incredible racial rage and anger that is playing out and justifying. DEI has become the justification for ripping apart the country and destroying the United States government and destroying all of our ability to make to create prosperity here in America. It's the Southern strategy 60 years later, sort of taken to its ultimate place. And we have to recognize that this is so, we heard Pete Hegseth say, David, I'm going on too long here and I'll end with this. Pete Hegseth say that diversity is not our strength, but our founding phrase as a country was e pluribus unum, right? From many one. It was a celebration of the diversity of the country and how it made us stronger. And so what I still remain stunned by, and you and I have been in the trenches on this stuff for a long time, I'm stunned by the rage, the racial rage, and the anger, and the willingness to let people die, and to give people to take people and treat them in ways to treat them as chattel, to treat them as something lesser than, and which is something that in this modern era is hard to even believe that we're at this place. But what it means is that once you cross that line, right, then we know from history that this can get a lot worse,
Yeah.
and that for all of us, and that we have to recognize that the need to fight and the need to do whatever you can every day, whatever's in your power, to go fight the creep of this awful, terrible, un-American administration is that we all got to leave it on the playing field, everybody, right? And
That's
we got to do,
correct.
we got to do it for our freedoms, for our families and our future. Because once this kind of rage, this out of control manic rage takes hold inside of a government, we know this can go to even darker places than they've already gone. And so we're here now. David, you've been a great teacher and guide to us over the last few months. I'm grateful for that. I'm sure you'll be coming back, because this project that you're talking about is in many ways the central project of Trumpism and the central project of the modern Republican Party over the last 60 years, which is to exploit the racial fear of white Americans and build then a politics around that. And we're seeing this now happen in a way that's out of control, wild, tyrannical, right? And all the things that you've described today. So we have a lot of work to do. And I'm just grateful for your continued advocacy for regular folks, in this fight, for the advice that you're giving to your clients, and for continuing to educate all of us through your writings, television appearances, public appearances, and occasional stop bys here at Simon's Substack. But thank you so
Anytime.
much, Dave. Thanks, David. Thanks, and keep up the fight.
Thank you, Simon. You too. Appreciate everything you're doing.
Take care, everybody. I'm going to figure out how to turn this off.